Picture this. It's midnight in Seoul. The city is alive. Neon lights stretch as far as the eye can see. K-pop blasts from storefronts, and somewhere in a gleaming skyscraper, Samsung engineers are designing the chip that will power next year's smartphones. From the outside, South Korea looks untouchable. A high-tech powerhouse, a cultural empire, one of the richest, most advanced economies on the planet. But here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. What if all of this could vanish, almost overnight? Not from a war, not from a financial crisis, but simply because one country decided to walk away. Because here's what the glossy economic headlines don't tell you. South Korea's entire miracle is built on a foundation it didn't construct alone. And if that foundation cracks, the whole building falls. Today, we're breaking down exactly why. We're going to look at the invisible security umbrella that doubles as an economic engine, the silicon chokehold that keeps Korea tied to American tech, and the impossible geopolitical tightrope Seoul walks every single day between Washington and Beijing. Let's get into it. Most people think of South Korea's economy in terms of exports, semiconductors, cars, steel, K-dramas even. But there's a deeper truth. South Korea's economy isn't just about what it sells, it's about trust. And that trust has a very specific source: 28,500 American troops stationed on Korean soil. Think about that for a second. Foreign investors, the people who pour billions into Korean stocks, Korean bonds, Korean real estate, they're not just betting on Samsung's next earnings report. They're betting that the Korean peninsula won't become a war zone. And the reason they feel comfortable making that bet is because the United States military is physically present, acting as a guarantee. Think of it like an insurance policy. When you own a house in a flood zone, you sleep better at night because you have insurance. The moment that insurance disappears, suddenly your house isn't worth nearly as much. That's exactly what the US military presence does for South Korea's economy. It suppresses what analysts call the Korea discount, the phenomenon where Korean stocks are perpetually undervalued compared to their actual fundamentals, simply because investors price in the North Korea risk. Right now, that discount exists, but it's manageable. Markets absorb it. Investors live with it. But imagine if the US pulled out. Overnight, that discount explodes. Suddenly, South Korea looks like a high-risk zone, the kind of label that sends institutional money running for the exits. You'd see capital flight. The Korean won would collapse, and a currency crash of that scale, it could hit like a sovereign default, the kind of economic shockwave that takes a decade to recover from. The security umbrella isn't just a military arrangement. It's the silent engine of South Korea's entire economic credibility. Now let's talk about the tech side of this story, because this is where it gets really fascinating. South Korea makes the chips that run the modern world. Samsung and SK Hynix together dominate global memory chip production. Samsung's foundry division competes directly with TSMC for the most advanced logic chips on Earth. Semiconductors alone account for roughly 20% of South Korea's total exports. On the surface, that sounds like an enormous amount of power. But here's the thing. Korea makes the chips, but the United States controls the ecosystem around those chips. What does that mean exactly? The machines that etch circuits onto silicon at a nanometer scale. Largely American and Dutch technology, with the Dutch company ASML sitting at the top of the supply chain. But ASML itself depends on US-controlled components and software to operate. The intellectual property, the chip architecture blueprints, that's American. The software tools used to design semiconductors, American. The export licenses needed to sell the most advanced chips to certain markets, issued in Washington. Without US licenses and software, Korean foundries literally cannot operate at the cutting edge. That's not an exaggeration. That's the technical reality. And then there's US policy. The CHIPS Act didn't just throw money at American semiconductor manufacturing. It came with strings attached for everyone, including allies. US policy now directly dictates where Korea can and cannot sell its most advanced technology. Remember when the US tightened chip export restrictions to China in 2022 and 2023? Korean companies had to scramble for exemptions just to keep their Chinese factories running. Washington essentially had veto power over Korean business decisions. Here's the brutal bottom line. If the US decided to cut Korea off from this tech ecosystem, the licenses, the machines, the design software, Samsung and SK Hynix would lose their competitive edge almost instantly. They'd be building yesterday's chips with tomorrow's price tags. Their market share would evaporate. The silicon shield cuts both ways. Yes, Korea's chips are strategically valuable to the US, but the US holds the keys to the factory. Now here's where the story gets truly uncomfortable. Because if South Korea's biggest security partner is the United States, its biggest trading partner is China. China buys more Korean exports than any other country. Korean companies have massive manufacturing operations inside China. The economic ties run deep, wide, and go back decades. So Seoul finds itself caught in what might be the most difficult geopolitical balancing act of the 21st century. On one side, Washington. On the other, Beijing. And the gap between them is getting wider by the year. The US is now actively pressuring Korea to de-risk from China, to reduce supply chain exposure, to limit technology transfers, to pick a side in the new tech Cold War. But think about what that actually means for Korea. If Korea chooses the US, fully, aligns completely, cuts China off, it loses its biggest customer. Exports fall. Growth slows. The Korean economy takes a structural hit it may not recover from quickly. If Korea drifts toward China, starts accommodating Beijing's demands, loosens its alignment with Washington, it loses its security guarantee, its tech access, and risks US sanctions. There is no clean answer. Every option has catastrophic downside risk. And the nightmare scenario? The one Korean strategists quietly worry about in private. Without US mediation and strategic backing, South Korea could slowly be absorbed into China's sphere of economic and political influence. And once that happens, once Washington perceives Seoul as an unreliable partner, the response could look something like what the US did to Venezuela. Not military confrontation, something quieter and more devastating. Economic isolation, sanctions, and the gradual cutting off of the dollar-based financial system that Korean banks and corporations depend on to function. That's the Venezuela scenario. And while it sounds extreme today, the tightrope Korea is walking makes it less unthinkable than it should be. And here's the thing. All of this is happening while South Korea is already dealing with serious internal economic pressure. South Korea has the lowest birth rate of any country on Earth. Consistently, year after year. The workforce is aging and shrinking. Fewer workers means lower productivity, higher pension burdens, and a government increasingly stretched to maintain social services. At the same time, Korean household debt is among the highest in the developed world relative to income. Ordinary Korean families are leveraged to the hilt, often just to afford housing in cities like Seoul, where real estate prices have been astronomical. What does this mean in the bigger picture? It means South Korea's economy is already carrying enormous weight before any external shock hits. The demographic crisis alone would be a multi-decade challenge for any government to manage. Add the debt burden on top of that, and you have an economy walking a tightrope internally. Before you even factor in North Korea, US-China tensions, or semiconductor supply chain politics. An economy under this much internal pressure cannot easily absorb a major external shock. The cracks are already there. The question is, what triggers the fracture? Korea isn't just borrowing money. In many ways, it's borrowing time. So let's zoom out. The miracle on the Han River. South Korea's transformation from one of the poorest countries on Earth to a global tech and cultural powerhouse in just a few decades. It's one of the most remarkable economic stories in modern history. But it was never just a Korean achievement. It was a partnership, a security alliance that became an economic alliance, a tech relationship that became a dependency, a geopolitical arrangement that kept the wolves at the door while Seoul built its skyscrapers. The United States isn't just South Korea's military ally. In a very real sense, it functions as the central bank of Korean stability, the entity whose backing gives the whole system its credibility. Remove it, and the gas pedal of the Korean economy hits a brick wall. Which leaves us with a question worth sitting with. Can any country ever be truly independent in a globalized world? Or are we all just one broken alliance away from collapse? Think about that. And if you found this video worth your time, subscribe, because every week we pull apart the hidden mechanics of the global economy to show you what's really going on beneath the surface.